to item number 16, approval of the mandated long-range property management plan for Yuba City successor agency.
So thank you. As I touched on just real briefly in the overview, the long-range property management plan is a plan that is mandated by AB 1484. It is basically the liquidation of all former redevelopment real estate. And so when the language came out, it was directed agencies to liquidate all properties as quickly and as for the best value possible. And so through the development of a long-range property management plan, we were supposed to identify all former redevelopment agency properties and how we're best going to dispose of those properties. Now, it does give us the option to retain some of those properties if they're found to be for public benefit or for public use. And we actually have one of those cases here. The other thing that it also did was that it superseded any other actions entered into by the redevelopment agency. And as the council and the successor agency is aware, we had actually entered into exclusive negotiation agreements with two potential land developers for redevelopment properties within our town center area. And while we were very close to getting to that next layer of approval, which would have been a development and disposition agreement, the level that we got to was not considered an enforceable obligation by Department of Finance. So the provision in 1484 right here basically said that that legislation trumped what we had already done with those two developers. But all along the way, we've been telling and communicating with our oversight board, and I would like to just, at this moment, compliment our oversight board because they have been very supportive through this effort, and I've heard horror stories where oversight boards have been very cantankerous and disagreeing with successor agencies on their direction. But our oversight board sees the big picture in that it makes more sense for us to continue forward with these prospective developers on the acquisition and future development of those properties because they do, in fact, represent the best opportunity to come away with a high-quality project that will, once it's built, will actually generate more tax increment for all the affected agencies. So it makes sense. So what we've done is taken a look at all the properties. We have a total of 8, and I won't bore you with all the details on each and every one of them, but I mentioned that we have one property that we're going to retain for public use, and that's this parcel way up here, parcel 1. As you can see here, it's on the Calusa Frontage Road, Plumas Street over here. Really, this piece of property doesn't really have a whole heck of a lot of value for any adjoining property owners. Certainly is not developable as a new use in and of it by itself. So we believe that this makes more sense for the successor agency or the city to hang on to and implement the ultimate vision for the Central City Specific Plan, which this is a part of, for a plaza or maybe even some other type of improvement, roadway improvement, transit improvement. But certainly it has a better use in return for the city as opposed to a private property owner.
My question was perhaps a transit area there to take that off of the street just to the north there that's been an issue.
We've identified a variety of different options in the property management plan, and so as long as we can demonstrate the basis for retaining it, that it is in the public interest, we believe that that should pass through Department of Finance. And that's something I should have pointed out at the beginning is that this plan tonight we're presenting to you as the City Council and as a successor agency, and then following your action we'll be taking this to the Oversight Board for their approval. If the Oversight Board approves it, which we're hoping they will, we then submit it to the Department of Finance. The Department of Finance can take as long as they see necessary to approve, modify, deny, or wherever they want to act on it. And then once, hopefully, they approve it, we get to start going forward with its implementation. And so for this piece, we're proposing to retain it and use it however we best see appropriate.
On your previous map, you showed some properties that were housing properties. Are those on Bridge Street that we had for the widening of Bridge Street or not?
They're sprinkled throughout the area, but yes, there are some on Bridge, and so we'll have to deal with that as part of this process as well as the NSP process.
Because I don't know if we have to buy those back out of the redevelopment agency or if we could use them as for public good because we're going to be widening Bridge Street. I don't know what the...
Yeah, that's an interesting argument that we're still researching because right now there is no real teeth there is no housing set-aside requirement because the redevelopment's gone. But yet there's new legislation coming out to replace that. And so, interestingly enough, we still have to, as the housing successor, provide housing audits, but there's still no requirement to produce that housing. But again, there's new legislation or new findings coming out from Department of Finance, who again get to be the judge, jury, and executioner in this whole process to interpret how they want it best to apply. So it's going to be interesting.
Because some of that property we did buy or purchase so that we could have it available for the Bridge Street widening. So is it possible that we may end up buying that from the successor agency
we may have
to have that available for that
Correct.
project in the future?
Correct.
But we can't put it through this process and say that it would be the public good to keep those rather than go through and have to buy them again?
Well, because the property management plan is intended to look at properties that we're selling, and it was determined when we presented to the City Council to serve as the housing successor at that time that we would go ahead and retain and hold on to all those housing assets and not include them in the property management plan so that we could deal with things like that when they came up.
All right, thank you.
So just real quickly, I wanted to get to the other properties that we're looking to do something other than selling for fair market value, which is really the gist of our proposal. And that would include parcels 2 and 3, which is for the Feather River Mills property, and then parcels 4 and 5, which is for I forgot the name, I just went right out with, thank you, the Hog Farm project with Mr. Newquist. And so just real quickly, focusing on those properties, this is the site of the Feather River Mill project that we're working exclusively with the Mehmet Noyan Company, with Mr. Noyan. We have taken actually an MOU to the Oversight Board and to this body as well. And so there's a clock that's ticking on the development or the next step for this project, and that starts ticking after this property management plan is approved by the Department of Finance, because it didn't make any sense to put a sunset date on something that we don't have any control over with the Department of Finance being involved. That's a detail of parcel 3. And then here's parcel 4, Mr. Newquist's piece that he's interested in building an event center. Thank you. Upon that, and then actually acquiring the property across the street over here as overflow parking or perhaps something else.
Parcel 7, that was just above the Newquist parcel. That one just goes away. It'll be sold to anybody, so the private sector would start coming in and
That's the plan.
kind of build whatever it's zoned for.
Yeah, it was certainly, so I should point that out, and that's an excellent question, is that just because it goes out on the open market doesn't mean that the city doesn't have, relinquishes control over it. We still have our Central City Specific Plan, our zoning ordinance, our general plan. It would be just like any other, private project that would have to come through and meet all of our design criteria. So whatever would come in there would have to comply with all of our rules and mirror what's down in the town center area anyway. So, excellent question.
Is it, Mayor?
Yes.
Another question for you, Aaron.
Yes, sir.
Parcel 7 and then also the Feather River Mills properties, I believe, have contamination on those properties.
Correct.
So how do we determine fair market value on those?
Well, that's something that we're proposing as part of the plan to the Department of Finance, that it would have to be included into the cost of the property or the transaction. So we're actually included on our ROP schedules from the very first one, a contingent liability cleanup, if you would, for those parcels. And for the Feather River Mill site, we estimated, based on some Phase 1 analysis, that it would be in excess of about $1.4 million. And so if the property, is appraised at $1.5 million, your net value is really, $100,000. So that would have to be included in that. And that is something that Mr. Noyan is aware of, and we've identified in the MOU And so that would be something that would be negotiated as part of the acquisition or disposition of that property.
To the mayor.
Yes.
And Mr. Noyan has previously acquired properties in other cities that have had contamination on them and has successfully gone through and cleaned those sites up?
That's absolutely correct, and that's why he came himself and met with, spoke to the oversight board, and that's where they concluded that he really represents the best opportunity for the successful development of that property, and that's why we're continuing to push in our property management plan to honor that agreement that we have with him.
And then, Aaron, what would we do in a case where, let's say that the cleanup exceeds the value of the property, which is likely to occur, or possibly could occur, on, I think it's Lot 7? What would we do with that property?
Well, that's an excellent question, and that's something that we're watching carefully with the Department of Finance to see how they've responded to that. The word that we're hearing is that if that's the case, then it may just sit there until we figure out a way to either get an interested buyer who is willing to take it, and all the liabilities that go with it, or if we are successful through getting additional tax increment, we could go ahead and at some point in time afford remediating that site, which is an option but highly unlikely just because of the time involved to do that. But those would be the two options that I would think of.
I would be interested to see if any other jurisdictions go back with litigation specifically to properties where cleanup may exceed, and being able to resolve it possibly that way. Where the Department of Finance would be the one potentially responsible for coming up with the money to clean that property.
It raises an interesting question because we did talk about that with our legal counsel, that especially for the Feather River Mill site, because we are working with someone there, that if through the cleanup process that we're able to go back to the original property owners that were found to be those responsible for contaminating the property at the onset, if there's any remediation funds that come out of that, how those would be allocated. And our goal would be to put that in the agreements that we enter into with the property, with the purchaser, that those funds would go back into the property as opposed back to DOF to be later distributed to the other agencies because they paid the price for that cleanup.
I think it'd be a good site for the future governor's mansion, so.
I agree. It would be lit all night long and not be any extra power off the grid.
So that concludes my presentation. So tonight we're looking for you as the City Council and as the successor agency to approve the Long Range Property Management Plan so that we can forward it on to the Oversight Board for their action.
Great. If there's not any questions, can I get a motion?
I'll move for approval of this item.
I'll second it.
A motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Wonderful. Motion carries.